There needs to be a certain amount of wisdom to this up front, which unfortunately postmodernist thinking and stuff with social justice, or more precisely critical social justice thinking, just doesn't bring. There is no wisdom in that, to be honest. Or at least I don't think there is. This article was sent to me by a contact, and I was asked to potentially give my thoughts on it. And I'll immediately say that from what I've read here, I was unimpressed. It was very much constructed, and you can tell as you're going through this, very much constructed from a postmodernist way of thinking about things. And as you talked about in history, if you've read Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, they break down what postmodernism is very well, in that, sorry, cat knocked things over. Postmodernism is at times either apathetic or outright hostile to science, and science being the science as we know here, a process by which we get at the truth, evidence, reason, and logic. Here, and that's what I got out of reading a lot of this, is that it is very postmodernist in its construction, which is unfortunate, because postmodernism doesn't lend itself well to scientists, as it were. A critical look at the practice and culture of science with calls to action. Efforts are ongoing to address iniquities in scientific fields. Here, the author provides a critical look at the practice and culture of science with calls to action to broaden participation and recognition of talented members from marginalized groups in the chemical sciences, which this should say this comes from Communications Chemistry, so it is a chemical journal. As chemists, we have crucial roles to play in guiding humanity's transition to a socially peaceful, just, and more sustainable future in the era of climate change through research, education, community engagement, and evidence-based policies. Now, one of the things I will say is, like, if you watch the other video this week, you know I was commenting on Nature's stupid doubling down, where they were basically handed a study which showed that their endorsement in 2020 backfired on them, and they decided they're going to do it anyway. They do it again anyway. Getting at evidence-based policies here, I do have to question whether this author is saying that scientists should advocate for specific policies, rather than providing the evidence and data needed to make those policies, whatever those policies happen to be, as crafted by others. In this case, rather than taking a position on it should be exactly this policy anyway. The other thing is that I will say this is the author's opinion. This is an opinion piece, and presumes that the role of chemists is to guide humanity's transition using, research, education, community engagement, and evidence-based policies. Again, when is it a job of a chemist to set a policy? Because the way that comes out is it's about setting policies. Not a job of a chemist to do that, and given other research recently, it would seem that would end badly to do that for your own credibility. And whether or not you're going to have the trust of the people you are trying to communicate with. Other question altogether. Research, education. You notice there's one thing in there that's not that's not present with this commentary. That's not the point to focus on here, because as he goes on to say, as the author goes on to say, this paper is the second excerpt from my lecture for the inaugural Canadian Society of Chemistry Gilead Award for Excellence in Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. First excerpt of the award was recently published. As an environmental chemist who started her academic career in 2005 in Canada, I highlight here my analysis and reflections of the culture of science and end with calls to action. Okay, so what follows is the second excerpt of the lecture that this author gave to the Canadian Society of Chemistry. Again, as I said, I was unimpressed. The last 2 years have shaken the consciousness of human societies because of the COVID-19 global pandemic, extreme graves, and what have you. let's see, last 2 years have shown the world how scientists work collaboratively and in real time to develop new vaccines, design new tools and technologies to detect and analyze airborne pathogens, purify indoor air, and quantify improvements to outdoor air quality because of lockdowns. We also witness unprecedented levels of openness to talk publicly about uncomfortable truths pertaining to equity, diversity, and inclusion in the sciences, including chemistry. The ongoing practice and culture of science has failed marginalized communities and mostly being used to cement the power of oppressors, partly leading to systematic social and economic inequities and racism. Leaders in academic institutions, societies, funding agencies, and publishers have finally acknowledged the need to shift the root causes of inequities facing marginalized groups from individuals to institutional cultures and policies that historically enabled the exclusion of the other. Okay. This is how you know it's coming from a postmodern frame of reference right away, is because it is already talking about power of oppressors. Talks about everything in the dialectic of oppressor versus oppressed in here. And I have no doubt from what I've read in this already, and we will get to that momentarily, that in equity here, or the definition with equity, while might be on paper equal opportunity or equal access or something like that, access in this case is measured in terms of outcomes. And so, really meaning equality of outcomes. Now, if you've read Thomas Sowell's Discrimination and Disparities, as I have amongst others have, the one other common assumption, and as I have seen in some of the in the papers that are cited later on, lots of uses of the disparity fallacy. Colin Wright recently referred to this as the univariate fallacy in a sort of broader sense. Coleman Hughes coined it as the disparity fallacy, and in just more plain logic, it's the single cause fallacy, and it is quite amazingly common. Any disparity is apparently, the fallacy is any disparity is caused by some kind of discrimination, systemic discrimination. Any disparity between groups is automatically caused by that. There's actually, in reality, multiple causes and reasons for that, potentially. And I will point you to Thomas Sowell's book, Discrimination and Disparities, where he talks about this ad nauseum with some very, very, very excellent empirical examples of that. But let us go a little bit further. Figure 1 shows an illustration of the ongoing practice and culture of science. EDI efforts bridge the gap between the higher objective of doing science, which is to be of service to society, and the composition, diversity, power structure, and dynamics within the scientific community. Now, we're going to pause right there. Between the higher objective of doing science, which is to be of service to society. This is the author's opinion. This is the author's opinion. There is no necessarily institutional saying to that. And I'm sorry. How are you being of service to society? Is it providing research? Okay, wait a minute. Given the sort of social justices framework here, I have to question whether or not the author thinks that science should be of service to social justice rather than its primary purpose. The purpose of science being a process by which we get at the truth, is the pursuit of the truth. That could be something that's nicely of service to society, and we would hope it is. It may not be. This reminds me of, you go into science, you can have an impact on things. You can have an impact. Well, maybe, but if your job is figuring out what the truth is, and your purpose, your telos as a scientist is the pursuit of the truth, then what you may find may be of service to society. It may not be at all. You may find that working on something for a particular community or what have you, answering a question that is of interest to a community or to a policymaker or to what have you, the results of your research, if you're doing it truthfully, if you're doing it with the point of pursuing the truth, may be a benefit to that policymaker. It may not be. That's not the point. It is not the point. As strange as it sounds, it's not necessarily the point to find things that are service to society, because that pushes to the realm of activism more so than the pursuit of the truth. Yes, what you can find in research can be of service to society, not necessarily so. The composition of the scientific community should ideally reflect the society being served and its changing demographics. However, composition alone is not enough, as it does not equal power. All about power dynamics again here for their kind of purpose of things. And I have no idea what is meant here by reflect the society being served. I can take a guess at what the authors mean here. Well, I'm sorry, what the author means here, because it is a singular author. I apologize. Ideally should reflect. What do you mean? What the hell do you mean? And, well, can you make the case for this? Because this is stated as a statement of fact, but there is no reference given. Let's see. Even in diverse settings, what do you mean by diverse? For one thing. Because if you go back in some of the old sociology research, diverse actually meant diversity of perspectives, which is great. Hire anybody in the sun. Go for it. Go for it. Diverse perspectives, awesome. All races, all backgrounds, everything. Diverse perspective. But what do you mean by diverse settings here in that case? And I want to check one thing. So one moment. I wanted to check on one thing before I made another comment here. And that was to check on some of these references. Even in diverse settings, scientists from underrepresented groups continue to be marginalized in scientific fields. I want to make a note that this particular reference here, and again, the references are at the bottom, so I hope you go look at it. I just read through that particular reference on the start of it. It starts from the classic assumption that comes from critical theory, or in this case, critical race theory, that racism is endemic. It starts from the assumption that it is. It does never actually prove it. Just starts from the assumption and then goes and look for anything that it could possibly claim as evidence. Very poor science on the part of that article that's being cited to begin with. The ingredients for doing good science are humans, who include mentors and students. Soft assets, which include time, freedom of thought, persistence, ability to prioritize hard work, ability to bounce back, good daily habits, and hard assets, which include money, space, tools, instruments, and computers. The combination of these ingredients enables knowledge generation through original research, scientific scholarly output, which comes in the form of peer-reviewed papers, new products, new policies, or changes to existing ones. No, hold it a second. The combination of these ingredients enables knowledge generation through original research, i.e., scientific scholarly output, which comes in the form of peer-reviewed papers, new products. A new policy isn't necessarily scientific scholarly output, and I would not count that there. Research which results in a new policy or changes to existing policies, the policy is not research. That doesn't count here as scientific scholarly output as far as I'm concerned. Yes, the research done in papers and presentations and sometimes new products are also the result of scholarly research, necessarily a scholarly output. A new policy, though, I don't necessarily think so with that. Some of that scholarly output has short and or long-term benefits to the wider community and or communities locally and globally. Some of it does, which is to say science is not always in service of society. Just a point there that I want to make. The peers in each scientific field are also humans who use the scientific evidence presented in scholarly output to judge and rank the merit of ideas and competency of other scientists. Peers also judge and rank the quality of scholarly output and stature of other scientists to justify recommendations for more or less assets needed to do the science. Recognitions of this scholarly output come in the form of invitations to speak at conferences, invitation to join expert panels, awards, promotions, and more titles, and coverage by science journalists in the media. Coverage by science journalists in the media is a recognition of a scholarly output. Therefore, the practice of science is labeled self-correcting, selective, and reinforced by feedback from peers, leading to the illusion that doing science is the most objective human endeavor for the pursuit of knowledge with little room for subjectivity. Okay. So, this is where I go back to Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge. He writes very well, actually, on what is actually going on in here. The reason that you might consider science to be collective, not just an individual discipline, is because you have so many people who have diversity of thought. If you talk to individual science, for example, they would not disagree with the notion that they are still somewhat biased. They're not perfectly unbiased. This is the reason we submit these things to peer review. This is the reason for the normative principle of organized skepticism. In other words, because I am one person with my own biases, we submit our work to others to check for those biases, to account for that, to defend our work, and to make certain that we didn't do something stupid that biases the results. In other words, one part of the process with peer review is actually doing your damnedest to check for whether or not the authors of a study used a biased method or used flawed logic, which critical race theory does, or if you've read some of the literature, pushing the critical social justice or postmodernist perspectives, you find that they often come at it with what's known as the disparity fallacy, meaning they pre-assume, as critical race theory does, that any disparity between groups is the result of some kind of discrimination, systemic discrimination most times. But they never actually prove that. They just pre-assume the disparity is evidence of that. Never actually have ever proved it. That's always been the assumption from the jump. Never mind the fact that it is logically quite flawed. See Thomas Sowell's discrimination to disparities for that, because he rips apart that assumption quite handily in the book. And so this is where it's important to understand, is that, does it mean it's perfect? Of course not. Nobody would tell you that. I've had my own critiques of peer review, as you might know. But it is probably the best thing that has been tried. As Jonathan Rauch points out in the Constitution of Knowledge, it is probably the best thing that has been tried, because it is by challenging and error correcting and submitting your work to the challenges of others and being able to defend that, that you end up finding what rises to the top and cutting through the chaff, if you will, to find the wheat. Oh boy. However, as detailed in the next session, while scientists aspire to be as objective as they can, they are not immune to historical and ongoing struggles that manifest in the form of and phobias. Oh, good grief. Leading to propagating an image about the scientific community as an exclusive club for elites. The influence of bias and stereotypes. Now, there is ample research evidence that shows that the influences of biases and stereotypes on the peer review process that limits or hinders access to power and privilege. Again, it's all about power and privilege for the postmodernists. It's never about the pursuit of the truth. And hence resources influences a culture driven by interest. What interests? Driven by what interests? And affects the choices of words used in describing scholarly output and the excellence of marginalized researchers. Hence, this research evidence clearly shows that science takes place on an uneven playing field because there's competition for limited resources that is more Darwinian than transparent, fair, and ethical. There's complex inter- and intra-research group dynamics fueled by individual worldviews, career aspirations. I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to say experiences, because if you've been on this channel long enough, you know I despise that phrase. And professional networks. The reason I despise it is the phrase lived experiences is redundant. An experience is by definition something you have lived through. Unless there's an unlived experience somewhere, which I have yet to see anybody do that. Anyway, the group dynamics are a reflection of a rigged education system and white supremacy in science that enables systems of oppression and racialization in science, and there are senior scientists in each scientific field who play a major role in making of the future leaders through the advancement and retention of a selected few that are deemed worthy of their time, energy, and backing. Oh, brother. So, first things first. I want to make a point here that I did read through a bunch of these articles. I read through this article and this article also. Again, a lot of what I saw in those reflected flawed logic. I also saw a lot of them that were simply screaming, well, such and such group doesn't get as many things as this, and then screaming that it's because of X systemic. It's evidence of a systemic racism. Never mind, they never actually prove it. So again, I saw a lot of what might be, and admittedly, I read them quickly, so I could be wrong. I will give that the benefit of the doubt there, and be nice that way. But I'm doubtful of a lot of these studies in actually breaking things down and trying to show that 100% of a disparity is the result of some kind of systemic discrimination. I'm actually very, very hesitant at that. I would also want to know, because there's, of course, research that some of these things, such as the implicit bias issue, is not predictive of behavior in science. Strike that. Let me try that again. Implicit bias tests can't predict behavior at all. Put it that way. They have very little, if at all, any predictive power when it comes to a person's behavior. And in a way, this makes sense, because one of the things you're supposed to learn at a university education is, of course, how to think critically, if you will, or engage in active thinking, and not go with those particular biases that you may have. And that's one of the reasons why. So, yeah, there is a lot of things here in terms of an assumption that assumptions that are going on here. That's the other thing I saw in a lot of these articles that I was reading, is it starts from an assumption that X is X, that X is in X. Poor assumptions to begin with. So, to level the playing fields, we need to go beyond equity to justice. What the hell does that mean? I know, maybe using the same word, but not the same dictionary, because I'm pretty sure they don't mean the same thing by justice that you or I mean. Where scientists in powerful positions of authority and influence fix the systems to offer equitable access to tools, opportunities, and recognition, and not put the onus of change in the culture of science on the marginalized. Okay. Equitable access here. Of course, we're talking about equity. Often what is meant is trying to give everybody equal opportunity. Well, not often what is meant. Often what is said is, oh, we just mean we're trying to give everybody equal opportunity and what have you, and all this other kind of stuff. What is actually meant with that is more so equal outcomes. And again, presuming that systemic discrimination of some form is what is preventing equal outcomes between groups, or is what's causing disparities between groups, is the better way to say it. Thomas Sowell, again, rips this apart pretty well. Rips apart the assumption that there is one cause for every disparity between groups in every field that exists. That is just fundamentally, it's a logical fallacy, which pervades a lot of the social justice scholarship, as you've noticed. And so I harp on that because it is a logical fallacy, and it leads to a question. Let us say, magically, today, you got rid of every possible barrier for every possible person who wants to go into a STEM field. Say today it happened, which, fine. Go for it. I'm game. I'm game for that. What if you... What would be your reaction if you did that today? That just happened magically today. Any possible barrier that you could think of that was caused by the system disappeared today. What would you do then if those disparities still existed 20 years from now, or didn't decrease as much as you thought they should? So that's the question I would ask in this is, what would you do if the disparities aren't gone when you get rid of every single barrier? Would you say, well, maybe there's probably some kind of systemic barrier that we didn't know about and we just need to interrogate the system more? Or would you reevaluate your theory? There needs to be a certain amount of wisdom to this up front, which unfortunately postmodernist thinking and stuff with social justice, or more precisely critical social justice thinking, just doesn't bring. There is no wisdom in that, to be honest. Or at least, I don't think there is. But anyway, this is more so about the other... the many other groups that are engaging in this nonsense, which you can see: Chemical Institute of Canada, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, Canada Research Chairs, the Royal Society of Chemistry, the American Chemical Society, which, if you remember, we had their inclusivity style guide the other day, Nature Portfolio, Science Magazine, DeGrooter. Oh boy. Lastly, to affect institutional EDI in a world facing changing demographics and climate change. Why climate change is always here is very strange to me, actually. Wouldn't you just do this even without climate change? Because these things are being instituted regardless, but fine. We, as members of the chemistry community, must acknowledge the centrality of human diversity to advancement and innovation in chemical research, education, and outreach to wider communities. Our goal should be to capitalize on the potential and talent of traditionally marginalized groups in chemistry by putting in place accountable and effective systems, policies, and programs that address the root causes of inequities head-on, welcome, encourage, support, retain, and advance the contributions of all. That is one heck of a run-on sentence. This way, we level the playing scientific fields and create a culture that acknowledges the spectrum of strengths brought to the table by individuals at all education and career stages without aiming to conform them to a template familiar to the majority. Also, this way, we, as chemists, will pride ourselves for working in a field that has the potential to guide humanity's transition to a better future for people and the planet. Activist dimension. What about pursuing the truth? Isn't that the job of a chemist? Or in part the job of a chemist, at least, or it should be the telos of a chemist, much as it is to many other scientists if you're doing research. Anyway, yeah, this is a lot more of an activist document than anything. And as I said, I'm unimpressed, because, at least from my assessment of reading this, it seems the author appears to believe that science is about activism rather than about pursuing the truth. That's what it appears to be. Be curious to know what others think. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious, everybody.